Steven Seagal walked into the hotel like any ordinary guest. No cameras, no entourage, no designer suit, just a simple jacket, jeans, and a calm, confident stride. The hotel itself was one of the most luxurious in the city: marble floors, golden lights, and staff trained to treat wealthy guests like royalty. But the moment Steven stepped inside, something felt off. The receptionist glanced up, scanned him from head to toe, and immediately looked away. Steven waited politely. Minutes passed. Guests behind him were greeted with smiles, warm voices, and quick service. But Steven stood there, completely ignored, as if he didn't exist. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "I'm here to check in." The receptionist sighed, annoyed. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone sharp and dismissive. "Yes," Steven replied. "It should be under my name." She typed lazily, then frowned. "I don't see anything," she said. "Are you sure you're at the right hotel?" Steven smiled slightly. "I'm very sure." That's when the manager stepped in. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, but his eyes were already judging Steven before hearing a word. The receptionist pointed at him. "He says he has a reservation." The manager looked Steven up and down, then smirked. "Sir, this is a private hotel. We don't allow loitering." Steven stayed calm. "I'm not loitering. I belong here." The manager laughed. "Look around," he said. "Do you really think someone dressed like you owns a room here?" A few guests nearby turned their heads. Whispers started. Steven took a slow breath. "I'd like you to check again." Instead of checking, the manager waved his hand toward security. Two guards approached immediately. "Sir," one of them said, "we're going to have to ask you to leave." Steven didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. He simply nodded and walked toward the exit, humiliated in front of everyone. But as he stepped outside, he stopped. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made one short call. What the hotel staff didn't know was this: they hadn't just kicked out a guest, they had kicked out the owner. And in exactly 9 minutes, their entire world was about to collapse. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere returned to normal almost instantly. The receptionist straightened her posture, the manager adjusted his tie, and the security guards went back to their posts, all convinced they had just dealt with a nuisance. Outside, Steven Seagal stood near the entrance, watching through the glass doors as guests laughed, checked in, and walked freely into the hotel he was just thrown out of. He didn't look angry. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked patient. Inside, the manager leaned over the counter and scoffed. "People like that always try their luck," he muttered. "They think confidence can buy them a room." The receptionist laughed quietly. Honestly, he didn't even look like he could afford the lobby. Another staff member joined in. You could tell he was lying the moment he opened his mouth. None of them realized how wrong they were. Outside, Steven remained calm, scrolling through his phone. Guests passing by glanced at him curiously, some with sympathy, others with judgment. A few whispered, wondering why a man so composed had just been escorted out. A couple approached security. "Why was that man removed?" one guest asked. The guard shrugged. "No reservation. Didn't belong here." Steven heard every word. Still, he said nothing. Inside, the manager received a message on his radio from upstairs staff about VIP arrivals. His mood improved instantly. "This is how professionals run a hotel," he said proudly. "We keep standards." What he didn't realize was that his idea of standards was nothing more than prejudice wrapped in authority. Steven leaned against a pillar near the entrance and made another short call. This time, his voice was low and controlled. "Yes," he said. "I'm outside." A pause. "No, don't rush. Just check." He ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. Minutes passed. Inside, the receptionist suddenly frowned at her screen. A system alert had appeared, subtle, easy to miss. She ignored it. Then another alert. She frowned again. Meanwhile, a guest who had overheard the earlier exchange whispered to his companion. Something about that guy felt different, but the staff continued joking, unaware that the situation was already slipping out of their control. Outside, Steven glanced at the large clock, mounted above the hotel entrance. 6 minutes had passed. He wasn't waiting for revenge. He was waiting for truth. And when truth arrives, it doesn't knock loudly. It walks in quietly and changes everything. Have you ever seen someone judged or humiliated just because of how they looked? Comment below and tell us which country or city you're watching from. The clock above the hotel entrance ticked quietly. Steven Seagal glanced at it once more. 7 minutes. He stood completely still, hands relaxed at his sides, as if nothing unusual had happened. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another man waiting outside a luxury hotel, calm, patient, unbothered. Inside, however, something had begun to shift. The receptionist leaned closer to her screen, her confident expression slowly tightening. The system alert she had ignored earlier was still flashing. She clicked on it this time. Her smile vanished. She blinked, then refreshed the page. Then checked again. "What is it?" the manager asked, without looking up. Nothing," she replied quickly. Though her voice lacked conviction, she stared at the screen once more, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The name displayed there didn't make sense. It couldn't. She whispered it under her breath. The manager finally looked up. "What name?" She hesitated. "It says Seagal." The manager scoffed immediately. "Yeah, right. Probably some prank reservation," but something in her tone made him uneasy. Outside, Steven shifted his weight slightly and exhaled. He wasn't angry. He wasn't nervous. He had seen situations like this before, moments where arrogance felt powerful, right up until the second it collapsed. 2 guests exited the hotel and paused when they saw him. "Didn't they just throw you out?" one asked cautiously. Steven smiled politely. "Yes, that's ridiculous," the man said. "You were calm the entire time." Steven nodded. "Sometimes calm is enough." The guests exchanged a look and walked away, still confused. Inside, the receptionist clicked deeper into the system. Her hands began to shake. She saw internal notes, ownership access, restricted files. Her stomach dropped. "Sir," she said quietly. The manager sighed in frustration. "What now?" "I think we made a mistake." That word mistake landed differently. The manager stood up and walked behind the desk, pushing her aside slightly to look at the screen himself. His confident posture stiffened. "What is this?" he muttered. He scrolled, his face drained of color. "No," he said quickly. "That's not possible." He refreshed the page. Same result. He checked another terminal. Same name, same access, same truth. Outside, Steven looked at the clock again. 8 minutes. Inside the hotel, panic began to ripple quietly, dangerously. The manager's mind raced as he replayed the last few minutes. The dismissal, the laughter, the security call, the escort. His throat tightened. "Where's security?" he snapped. "They're at the front," the receptionist replied, barely able to breathe. "Get them, now." Meanwhile, the hotel's regional executive director, a woman known for her strict standards, was already on her way. The call Steven had made hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't been threatening. It had been simple. "Please verify." Verification was enough. Outside, one of the same security guards who had escorted Steven out earlier glanced at him again. Something felt wrong now. "You still here?" the guard asked, less confident than before. Steven nodded. "I said I'd wait." The guard hesitated. "For what?" Steven met his eyes. "For honesty." The guard said nothing. Inside, footsteps echoed loudly across the marble floor as senior staff rushed toward the entrance. The receptionist was pale now, gripping the counter for support. "We need to fix this," she whispered. The manager swallowed hard. "We need to apologize." Outside, the clock struck the final minute. 9 minutes. Steven straightened slightly, not with pride, but with readiness. The glass doors burst open, and suddenly, the entire hotel realized the man they humiliated wasn't powerless. He was the one who owned everything they stood on. If you were standing there watching this unfold, would you step in or stay silent? Tell us in the comments. The glass doors swung open so fast they nearly slammed against the walls. The manager stepped outside first, his confident posture from earlier completely gone. His tie was crooked now, his face pale, eyes darting as if searching for a way out of a nightmare he had created. Behind him followed the receptionist, 2 supervisors, and one of the hotel's senior executives, all moving with the urgency of people who had just discovered they were standing on thin ice. Steven Seagal stood exactly where he had been the entire time. Calm, still, waiting. For a brief second, no one spoke. The manager cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir, Mr. Seagal," he began. Steven looked at him, expression unreadable. "You asked me to leave," Steven said quietly. The words weren't angry. They were factual. The manager's shoulders dropped slightly. as if the weight of those words had finally crushed him. Yes, he admitted, and we were wrong. People nearby began to slow their steps. Guests who had witnessed the earlier scene stopped completely now, sensing that something serious was unfolding. The manager gestured awkwardly toward the entrance. Please, come back inside. Steven didn't move. Why? He asked calmly. The question hit harder than any shout ever could. The receptionist's eyes were glossy. We didn't recognize you, she said softly, almost pleading. Steven tilted his head slightly. And if I wasn't who you think I am now, he asked, would this apology still be happening? No one answered. That silence spoke louder than words. Inside the hotel, staff members gathered at a distance, whispering frantically. Some checked their phones, others stared at the floor. The earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by fear and regret. One guest leaned toward another and whispered, Who is he? Another replied quietly, I think he owns the place. The realization rippled outward. Steven finally stepped forward, crossing the invisible line between outside humiliation and inside authority. Every footstep echoed against the marble floor, each one heavy with consequence. Inside the lobby, he stopped. He turned slowly, surveying the space not with pride, but with disappointment. This hotel, he said evenly, was built on the idea of respect. The manager nodded rapidly. Yes, absolutely. But today, Steven continued, I watched that respect disappear the moment I walked through those doors. No one dared interrupt him. I wasn't offended when you questioned me, Steven said. I was offended when you decided who I was, before you knew anything about me. The receptionist began to cry silently. A senior executive stepped forward, her voice shaking. We failed, she said. And we take responsibility. Steven looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Good, he said, because responsibility is where change begins. The crowd in the lobby had grown now. Phones were raised discreetly. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't just an apology. It was a reckoning. The manager swallowed hard. What would you like us to do, sir? Steven paused. For a moment, it seemed like he might let it go. Then he spoke. I want everyone who witnessed what happened to stay right where they are, he said calmly. The manager's eyes widened. I want to hear who spoke up, Steven continued. And who stayed silent? The tension thickened. Staff members exchanged nervous glances, because in that moment, they all realized something terrifying. This wasn't about a mistake anymore. It was about character, and not everyone in that room was going to pass the test. The lobby felt smaller now, not because the space had changed, but because everyone inside it felt exposed. Steven Seagal stood at the center, calm and unshaken, while the hotel staff slowly formed an uneven line in front of him. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared straight ahead, their faces tight with fear. Just minutes earlier, these same people had watched him be escorted out like a nobody. Now, no one dared to speak. Steven broke the silence. I want to be very clear, he said evenly. This is not about embarrassment. This is about behavior. He turned slightly toward the manager. You made a decision about me without facts, Steven continued. Then you allowed others to follow that decision without question. The manager swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Steven raised a hand gently. Don't agree with me yet, he said. Listen first. He turned toward the receptionist. You laughed when I said my name, he said calmly. Why? The receptionist's voice trembled. I assumed. Steven stopped her with a look. You assumed, he repeated. That assumption is what sent me out those doors. She nodded, tears forming. I'm sorry. Steven nodded once, acknowledging her words but not absolving them. He stepped forward, now addressing the entire staff. How many of you believed something felt wrong? He asked. No one answered. Steven waited. Slowly, one young employee raised a hand. His voice was barely audible. I thought maybe we should check again. Steven turned toward him. And did you say anything? The employee shook his head. No, sir. Steven nodded. That silence mattered. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. He continued walking slowly down the line. Each step felt like a verdict being prepared. Power, Steven said, is not in uniforms, titles, or keys. Power is in how you treat people when you think they have none. The manager's face burned with shame. Steven stopped walking. When I was escorted out, he said, not one of you asked if this was right. You asked if it was easy. A murmur spread through the lobby. Guests were openly recording now. Steven turned back toward the manager. Do you know why this is dangerous? he asked. The manager shook his head slightly. Because today it was me, Steven said. Tomorrow it could be someone who doesn't get a second chance. The silence was suffocating. Steven took a breath. I don't want apologies given out of fear, he said. I want accountability given out of integrity. He looked toward the senior executive. Who was on duty? He asked. She hesitated, then answered honestly. All of them. Steven nodded. Then all of you are responsible, he said calmly. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The manager stepped forward desperately. Sir, please, this was my fault. Steven looked at him closely. You were in charge, he replied. So yes, it was. He paused. But leadership also means consequences. Steven turned to the security guards. You followed orders, he said. But you also had eyes. The guards stood frozen. Steven looked back at the staff one final time. Today, he said, you didn't fail as employees. Everyone held their breath. You failed as human beings. The words landed with devastating weight. Steven straightened his posture, his voice steady. Final, I will decide what happens next, he said. But understand this walking away would be easier. He glanced toward the entrance, where he had been humiliated just minutes earlier. Staying, he continued, is how change begins. The manager's knees nearly buckled, because everyone in that lobby knew what was coming next. This wasn't the end. It was the moment before judgment. The lobby was silent, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, suffocating silence that comes right before something irreversible happens. Steven Seagal stood still for a moment, looking at the faces in front of him. Some were pale, some were defiant, some looked like they were already calculating how to save themselves. He spoke calmly. I gave each of you time, he said. Time to speak up, time to do the right thing. No one responded. Steven nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this. Then this decision becomes simple. He turned to the senior executive beside him. Please record this, he said quietly. Her eyes widened, but she nodded. Steven faced the staff again. Every employee on duty today, he said, voice steady and unmistakably firm, is relieved of their position effective immediately. The words hit like a shockwave. Gasps echoed through the lobby. The receptionist covered her mouth. The manager staggered back a step. All of us? He asked, disbelief cracking his voice. Steven met his eyes. Yes, but some of them didn't even speak, the manager pleaded. Steven's response was calm and devastating. Exactly. He let the word hang in the air. Silence, Steven continued, is how abuse survives. The manager's shoulders slumped. Security guards exchanged panicked looks. Guests watched in stunned silence. Phones raised, recording every second. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He didn't celebrate. That was what made it terrifying. I am not firing you out of anger, he said. I am doing it out of responsibility. And, ever, he turned slightly, addressing the room. This hotel does not need employees who follow prejudice more quickly than policy. No one argued now. One by one, access cards were placed on the counter. Keys followed. Name badges. The sound of plastic and metal hitting marble floors echoed louder than shouting ever could. The manager stepped forward again, desperation in his eyes. Sir, I've worked here for 12 years. Steven nodded. And today, he replied, you taught 12 years of employees how to treat someone they thought was powerless. The man looked down. Steven turned to the young employee who had earlier admitted he felt something was wrong. You, Steven said. The employee froze. You noticed, Steven continued, but you stayed silent. Yes, sir, the employee whispered. Steven held his gaze. Let this be the lesson you carry to your next job, he said. Courage is useless if it arrives too late. The employee nodded, tears forming. The senior executive cleared her throat. What happens now? She asked carefully. Steven exhaled slowly. Training will begin immediately, he said. New leadership, new standards, zero tolerance. He turned toward the crowd of guests. I apologize, he said sincerely. Not as an owner, but as a human being. The crowd erupted not in cheers, but in stunned murmurs. Someone whispered, he really fired everyone. Another said, I've never seen power used like that. Steven began walking toward the exit. Not because he was leaving again, but because he was done speaking. Just before stepping through the doors, he paused and turned back. Remember this, he said quietly. Respect is not optional. It is not earned by wealth or clothes. It is owed by default. Then he walked out. Outside, cameras followed him. The story was already spreading. But the debate had only begun. Do you think Steven made the right decision? Type yes if this was justice or no if you think firing everyone went too far. Let's talk about it in the comments. By the time the sun set that evening, the story was everywhere. A 30-second clip, shaky, filmed on a phone, spread across social media like wildfire. It showed a calm man standing in a luxury hotel lobby while employees silently handed over their badges. No yelling, no chaos, just quiet accountability. The caption read, "Hotel owner fired entire staff after being kicked out for how he looked." Within hours, millions had watched it. Some praised Steven Seagal for his restraint and leadership. Others argued he'd gone too far. News anchors debated it. Commentators dissected it. Hashtags trended worldwide. But one thing was undeniable. No one was ignoring it. Morning shows replayed the footage, freezing on Steven's face as he delivered his final words. Legal analysts weighed in on employee conduct. Social justice advocates highlighted the danger of appearance-based judgment. Corporate leaders quietly took notes. Inside the hotel, everything had changed. Temporary staff were brought in overnight. Emergency training sessions were scheduled. New policies were printed and posted, not in fine print, but in bold letters behind the front desk. Every guest is treated with respect. No exceptions. Steven returned the next day quietly. No cameras this time. He walked through the lobby slowly, observing. The energy was different. Heads lifted. Smiles weren't forced. They were careful, intentional. A young trainee greeted him. "Good morning, sir." Steven nodded. "Good morning." That was all. Later that day, Steven released a short statement. No long explanation. No self-praise. Just a few lines. This was never about punishment. It was about responsibility. Power reveals character, not status. The statement went viral on its own. People began sharing their own stories. Times they were ignored, judged, humiliated, and for the first time, many felt seen. Meanwhile, the former employees faced reality. Some took responsibility. Others blamed the system. A few admitted publicly that they'd never questioned how quickly they judged people. One former staff member posted online, "I thought I was just following orders. I didn't realize silence was a choice." That post alone received thousands of comments. Steven watched none of it. When asked in an interview if he felt satisfied, he paused before answering. "Satisfaction isn't the goal," he said. "Change is." The interviewer pressed him. "Would you do it again?" Steven didn't hesitate. "Yes," he replied. Because if no one draws a line, nothing changes. The hotel's reputation, surprisingly, didn't collapse. It improved. Bookings increased. Guests said they felt safer, more respected. The story became a warning and a promise. Judge less, treat better. Weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at the hotel's office. It was from the young employee who had stayed silent. It read, "I was afraid to speak that day, but I won't be again. Thank you for the lesson I didn't know I needed." Steven folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not as a trophy, as a reminder, because real power isn't loud. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't seek applause. Real power teaches even when it's uncomfortable. And that day, in a luxury hotel lobby, a lesson was taught that the world wouldn't forget. If you believe respect should never depend on clothes, money, or status, type "respect" in the comments. And subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us what real leadership looks like.